Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. So welcome to the final lecture of our Fall 2020 Cofrin Logan Center seminar series. I want to welcome everyone who's part of our CLC family, including our students, trainees, faculty, and staff, but also extend a special welcome to our friends of the center who are joining us from other departments at KU or other universities and centers. I even see in the participant list a few people that are joining us from APA Division 50, Society of Addiction Psychology. So it's really great to have you with us this morning for what I think is going to be a great presentation by one of our up and coming rising um, early career scientists in our field. So for those of you that are joining us for the first time, the Cofrin Logan Center was established in 2018 at the University of Kansas to bring together researchers, practitioners, KU students, and community partners to address challenges of addiction. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'm going to spend a little bit of time telling you about how today's webinar will work. Dr. Lui will be presenting her slides on the screen, and she'll be having video and voice, and a small selection of attendees have the option of turning on their video feed, while others will just have audio only. But we ask that everyone mute their microphones throughout the talk. At the end of the talk, we will have some time for questions. This will be moderated by myself and the rest of the organizers of the panel. So you should submit your questions directly to me. So my name is Michael Amlung. You'll find me in the chat window as a direct message at the bottom of your Zoom window. And if we have time to ask your question, we'll call your name out, we'll unmute your microphone, and you can ask your question. We may not go in the exact order in which questions are received, and we likely will not have time to get to all of the questions. So we just appreciate your understanding on that. I want to once again acknowledge Sergey and Drew for their coordination and logistical support for this seminar series. And we will be very excited in the very near future to announce our Spring 2021 speaker series. So please watch Twitter and our CLC website for more information. We have 3 really esteemed, outstanding speakers coming in the spring, so you will not be disappointed. So now I'm thrilled to introduce my friend and colleague and our final speaker in the CLC seminar series. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Priscilla Lui from the Department of Psychology at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, where she's an assistant professor. And she's also the director of the Acculturation, Diversity, and Psychopathology team, or the ADAPT group. She received her bachelor's degree from the University of Washington, a master's from Cal State University, LA, and a PhD in clinical psychology from Purdue. And then she did her pre-doctoral internship at Northwestern University School of Medicine. Her interests and expertise is in the area of health disparities and minority mental health, with work in many areas, including acculturation, discrimination, cultural values, intergenerational conflict, among others. But most relevant to today, her lab is interested in personality and individual difference determinants of addictive behaviors and other forms of psychopathology. She already has a very distinguished career, being named a rising star by the Association for Psychological Science in 2019, and an early career award for distinguished contributions to diversity in clinical psychology from the Society of Clinical Psychology. But what I think is most impressive about Priscilla, apart from her own impressive research, is her advocacy for open science, transparency, and rigorous statistical methodologies, as well as representation in science. And I have the privilege to work with her as in her role as one of the 2 co-chairs for the 2021 CPA conference, which is happening in March. So we are very excited to have Dr. Lui with us this morning to share some of her recent work examining alcohol use and misuse among Hispanic individuals. So welcome, Dr. Lui.
Well, thank you, Michael, for that very kind introduction. So, well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining in this morning on a Friday, right before Thanksgiving. So I'll be talking to you a little bit about some recent and ongoing work in our lab on Hispanic alcohol use, particularly sort of the interactions between sociocultural and individual difference factors. So in terms of kind of how I got to, arriving at these research interests is really the persistent observations in our field with regard to some ethnic health differences as well as ethnic health disparities. So health differences are not really surprising. They're just, simply maybe mean level differences in the prevalence rates of diseases, as well as sometimes maybe different manifestations of symptoms. Now, health disparities, on the other hand, represent a specific type of health difference. Health disparities particularly is more problematic to the public health because they represent these health differences across ethnic groups and sometimes within ethnic group because of social disadvantages. So what that means pertaining to alcohol use is that compared to whites and Euro-Americans, ethnic minority individuals such as Hispanics and African Americans are disproportionately more affected negatively by hazardous drinking and other sort of negative consequences associated with drinking and other addictive behaviors. So there has been generations of research on kind of understanding what's going on with these health disparities. So the first generation of health disparity research has really focused on basically identifying, documenting that these patterns exist. And a second sort of generation of health disparity research has to do with understanding the sociocultural determinants that might underlie these disparities. And certainly for the third and fourth generations of disparities research, we're trying to understand what are maybe active ingredients that we can reduce disparities and help people sort of do better. So over the past generations, many years, we have known that sociocultural determinants such as access to healthcare, as well as some vulnerability factors that might be more differentially affecting minority groups or are greater vulnerability factors for these populations are to be blamed. So what's particularly striking is even when we account for socioeconomic differences, ethnic health disparities still persist. So it really has to sort of speak to the idea that ethnic minorities are less likely to be able to seek and also complete quality healthcare, probably because of some individual and cultural barriers to seeking treatment. And even when they do end up in treatment, however, they're also less likely to complete them because maybe the treatment that's available to them are not really adequately addressing their cultural and community needs. Now, I come at kind of understanding health disparities from a perspective of minority mental health and addiction. So what that means is because there are these differential risks or maybe greater risks to disparities for ethnic minority populations, we really ought to understand their lived experiences, sort of something that's specific to their being. So my research taps into, as Michael talked about at the beginning, taps into two lines of interest. One has to do with how do people make cultural adaptation, especially when they're in kind of intercultural contact and make cultural transitions. What goes on with those psychological processes and how are those processes related to their health risk and addictive behavior, such as alcohol misuse? The other line of research really has to do with racism and discrimination, which is basically intercultural contact that is hostile. And so I won't have time to go into that today, but I will kind of just touch on some of the where I see this field and where I see my research going in this particular line of research. Especially, I think their field is finally recognizing, hey, racism is a public health pandemic issue as well. So in today's talk, let's start with sort of ethnic differences in alcohol use and misuse. So at CLC, I certainly don't need to convince anybody that alcohol misuse is a very common externalizing problem, and it comes with a host array of negative health, personal, and social consequences. And particularly people who are in their emerging adulthood, especially if they're college bound or attending college, they're most likely to have engaging in problematic drinking behaviors and maybe more likely to also have these negative consequences as well. Even across the lifespan, looking at different ethnic groups, we see that yes, Euro-Americans and whites are actually more likely to endorse high levels of drinking and are more likely to be diagnosed with an alcohol use disorder. Latinx or Hispanics are actually second to these rates. And what is particularly concerning, at least to me and other epidemiologists, is the fact that Hispanics, if we control for level of consumption, they actually experience even more negative consequences associated with drinking. And certainly they're less likely to be able to have access to complete quality healthcare. Even across, even if we think about across ethnic differences, we also see there are within ethnic group differences as well. So it's interesting, which I get to later on in the talk here, is that Hispanics who are born in the US with immigrant parents or maybe immigrant grandparents are actually more likely to suffer from more negative consequences associated with drinking and are more likely to drink heavily compared to their immigrant counterparts. So some of these differences are really interesting to me because I love to solve a puzzle usually. And we have to think about in a lot of ways, what is going on with regard to these ethnic differences and what is going on with these disparities. As I talked about earlier, we have shown that these ethnic disparity patterns are usually not accounted, at least not fully, by genetic differences, not fully by biological vulnerabilities. So it really, to me, I find a kind of a comprehensive social ecological framework to be helpful in organizing my thinking about what happens to the individual that led to them engaging in alcohol use and misuse under sort of different sociocultural influences. So I find the Bronfenbrenner's model to be particularly helpful. So on the one hand, thinking about individuals, alcohol use and misuse, we can sort of talk about their genetics and then also maybe phenotypic expressions of these biological vulnerabilities, such as personality, and other traits at an individual level that we can observe across people are these, alcohol-related beliefs and, such as motives and, what they expect out of drinking. And, certainly we know that people's immediate environments have a particular impact on their drinking. So years of research have shown that if, individuals whose parents have misused alcohol or other substances, they're also more likely to be disposed to alcohol use risks themselves as well. And at the individual and the community level, there are also sort of these characteristics of things like poverty levels or crime rates in the neighborhood that can also predispose people to maybe different types of stressors, and certainly also access to alcohol and drugs in differential rates. And encompassing it all, I find values and beliefs and practices that are always reinforced in any given culture. They're probably shared, kind of universal to individuals in any given cultural context. And so in my thinking, I tend to approach minority health and also health disparities research in terms of addiction from the kind of perspective that what is going on with the individual's environments and then how they are, their own characteristics might be a fit or misfit with the environments in which they're embedded. And hopefully this kind of lens helps us kind of develop a comprehensive understanding of not only individual differences in alcohol use behaviors, but also across the population. So we can see what are some processes or factors that are generalizable to everybody, and then what are some factors that are maybe more distinctive or maybe more salient for different segment of the population. Now, unfortunately, I don't think our existing knowledge base is quite, there in terms of achieving this goal. In my mind, I think the significant limitation really has to do with parallel and oftentimes non-intersecting research foci that we see. So on the one hand, we have a really rich body of literature, sort of the mainstream research pertaining to addiction, sort of understanding what are some of these individual difference characteristics that are common across individuals. So things ranging from genetic vulnerabilities, impulsivity, delayed discounting, which a lot of folks here at CLC focus their research on. And this kind of body of research is really interesting and important for us to understand what are some basic foundations for these vulnerabilities to addiction. At the same time, it's unclear whether these presumably common or universal processes or factors are actually equally generalizable to different populations, because predominantly, or at least historically, a lot of these samples are focusing on Euro-Americans. And if we kind of flip back to back in the day when you had paper copies of journals, if we flip back to those journals, a lot of the studies don't even report who their participants are, assuming people are people. On the other hand, there's also the ethnic minority focused research, which tends to study these ethnic specific or maybe group specific experiences without sort of considering, well, how are these group specific experiences or factors comparing to these individual difference factors? Do they help us understand addictive behaviors over and above these other more common kind of factors? Or are there some kind of interactions or maybe specific patterns that need to be gleaned from these ethnic specific populations? So taken at a face value, I think each of these bodies of research is really important and provides some aspects of the picture of what goes on with addictive behaviors. Unfortunately, I don't think if we consider them separately, they don't really come together and paint a complete picture of alcohol use and misuse across diverse ethnic groups. And that is kind of why I spend my my research energy, and I also see where our science needs to go in bridging both mainstream and minority-focused research. So in today's talk, just kind of as an organizer, I'll share some findings on using a meta-analysis to understand the associations between acculturation and alcohol use within Hispanics, and also some findings with Hispanics at the US-Mexico border, as well as some kind of qualitative findings to help us understand what are maybe some theoretical understandings of within ethnic differences. And I'm very excited to share sort of where we're currently taking our research, and I'm really curious to see what folks have to say about kind of the future directions as well. So before we go any further, I just want to, so that we're on the same page in terms of terms, because when we talk about ethnic labels, there are a lot of preferences and a lot of differences. So for the most part, we're referring to people who are Hispanics, so we're talking about people who are Spanish speaking in the US and usually come from Latinx, Latin American backgrounds or geographical regions. So if we ask people, how would you define your own background? People would prefer to go by their national origin. So whenever possible, in one of the studies, we specifically focus on Mexican Americans or Cubans or Puerto Ricans, for example. Now, if given the forced choice of Hispanics and Latino, more people actually prefer the label Hispanic versus Latino. Especially this is the case in Texas, because most people of Mexican backgrounds would prefer the label of Hispanics as how they self-identify versus Latino. And that is where I drew most of my samples in the presentation today. So you see me using the word Hispanic over Latino more likely. So just as a side note, I think our field is increasingly trying to be gender inclusive. So we're trying to move away from Latino, Latina, and use the word, Latinx. But what's interesting is recently Pew Research Center shows that only about 30% of the Hispanic or Latinx population have heard of the term even. And only about 3% of individuals use Latinx as a term to self-identify. So it's just kind of interesting to me that academics sometimes do things that are maybe not necessarily, on par with what the community is doing. So, so regardless, first of all, I kind of want to, sort of talk to you about my work on acculturation and Hispanic alcohol use. So for someone coming from an immigrant background, I find this cultural adaptation process particularly intriguing. So I think Michael earlier talked about my lab name is Adapt, because I find people always adapting to their environments. We have the agency to use our resources to thrive and to do well and weather different challenges. Cultural adaptation is one of those processes that we typically think about when immigrants are making cultural transition. So in the picture here, they're packing up their bags, moving either individually or with their family, maybe going from Mexico to the US. Now, cultural adaptation can also affect people who are not in cultural transition directly, but they come from immigrant backgrounds or immigrant families nevertheless, because they're usually juggling two sets of cultural expectations. One from the host US mainstream culture, and maybe through friends and family, and then the other through their heritage family, kind of in talking to their parents and same ethnic peers. So this kind of a process has been studied quite a bit in both epidemiological, ethnic minority, and cultural research, which is known as acculturation. So to me, acculturation is a process that engages psychological, behavioral, and social changes when people are navigating these intercultural contact. So over the past, I would say 20, 30 years, I think our field finally is in agreement that acculturation is at least a bi-dimensional and multi-domain construct or a process. What that means is we can think of people how they're acculturating to the US mainstream, meaning how well immersed they are in the mainstream US culture. Do they prefer to speak language, and what kinds of foods, in the American mainstream that they prefer, and their friends that they hang out with, as well as inculturation, which is their ties and connections to their own heritage culture. So these two sometimes are correlated when we measure them simultaneously, but conceptually they're considered independent and orthogonal. And each of these acculturation or inculturation orientation can manifest both in behavioral repertoires. The most common behavioral repertoires are, language or friends and affiliations, and the behaviors that people engage in celebrations of, national holidays and so forth, as well as cultural values such as collectivism, individualism, and so forth, as well as their own personal ethnic or American identification as well. So the reason that a lot of research has really focusing on how acculturation might be associated with addiction or other health behaviors is the fact that because people's immersion in these cultural environments or having contacts with friends and family, it usually can be a vehicle that promotes cultural learning about a specific type of health behavior, such as what it means to be a drinker and how you engage in drinking and how often and who do you drink with. At the same time, if you remember earlier when I was talking about, I'm interested in how people navigate their environments at different levels. If their individual characteristics are not a good match for the environmental challenges or demands, it can really elicit stress, right? So stress can actually also predispose these addictive behaviors, especially if we think about alcohol as one of the very common substances people are using as a coping mechanism. So that's why it's not surprising that acculturation has been studied as a determinant for alcohol use ever since 1967. That was the first published study that we could find. And we actually conducted a qualitative narrative review a couple of years back, looking at the associations between acculturation and drinking in college students. And what we saw was it's really quite a mess. There are a lot of mixed findings. We don't really know, from the studies published, what exactly are the direction of the associations and also what is the magnitude of the associations. So in order to understand the link between acculturation and alcohol use outcomes with Hispanics, we conducted a systematic meta-analysis of published studies. So how we defined acculturation in this particular meta-analysis was based on how research have collected the data. So a lot of earlier research particularly have been using demographic proxies with the assumption that people who are born in the US are more likely to be acculturated to the US and more Americanized compared to their immigrant counterparts, or if they've been in the US for a longer period of time, they're also going to be more acculturated to the US. And we also use the current best theoretical conceptualization, looking at behaviors, values, and cultural identification as well. So we looked at a host array of alcohol use outcomes for both Hispanics, which I will talk about in this particular talk, and we simultaneously conducted a meta-analysis with Asian Americans as well. And I would just say the findings are very similar, quite consistent, despite that these two groups actually have very distinctive immigration histories and receptions in the US, and also drinking cultures from Hispanic countries and Asian countries are very different. So after we conducted our initial search and screening and coding, we ended up with 88 independent study samples. And we calculated the average effect size between the acculturation and alcohol use using robust variance estimation to account for independency within each study. And then we also wanted to see what are some participant as well as study characteristics that might account for these between study variability. So here's just a snapshot of the 88 independent samples. So as you can see, there are actually quite a bit of variability and differences in terms of not only the direction of, so here is where a zero correlation would be. So not only the direction of the correlation, as well as the magnitude, but also the precision of the effect sizes. So that makes meta-analysis a really interesting tool to be able to sort of synthesize this knowledge base. So what we found was, if we're looking at just the omnibus association between acculturation and alcohol use, it was 0.09, which is not a huge correlation if you remember your basic stats, right? And there's certainly a lot of variability as we expected. One determinant of these variability has to do with the types of drinking outcomes that we're measuring. So we see positive and statistically significant association between acculturation, broadly defined, and drinking status, as well as intensity of drinking, so frequency by quantity, as well as the severity of binge drinking and drinking-related consequences. And our moderator analysis indicated that, well, actually the effect size for men was kind of hovering about 0, or sometimes slightly positive direction, but the effect sizes are much more robust for women. Meaning for women, the positive influence of acculturation on drinking related outcomes are particularly stronger. Same thing with emerging or general adults compared to adolescents. And we also see that for hazardous drinking or negative drinking related consequences, the association was stronger for people in a clinical setting compared to college or community settings. And finally, what was particularly interesting was throughout our synthesis of this literature, we noticed that a lot of the studies that have been published really are conducted in mainstream US context, meaning they are in the sort of the continental US and not necessarily in places where we call ethnic enclaves. So you can imagine if people are living in environments where they have to day-to-day wise, they're in contact with white peers or have to use English language and sort of immerse in that mainstream US context, it's very different compared to if they are living in the Mexico border town. Because their environments, not only within their family, but other people surrounding them are very Mexican oriented. So we started wondering, do these geographical regions or contexts matter in terms of how acculturation might have an implication on people's drinking related outcomes? And on top of acculturation, what about people's reasons for drinking? So, which I'll talk about in a little bit, that drinking motives has been considered to be one of the pretty much the last step before people's engagement in drinking behaviors. So does acculturation have anything to do with people's drinking motives? Does that predict over and above or have an interaction? So that led us to conduct a study using kind of a secondary data analysis, if you will. So the study was originally collected as a part of a Hispanic sexual health study. And what was interesting, what we wanted to do was we wanted to see what happens when we're outside of this mainstream US context, where in an ethnic enclave kind of environment where culture is constantly intermixing, particularly at the border, where a lot of people are coming from Mexican backgrounds, and it's a highly mobile environment where people are, maybe you can think of, if I'm in the US, I can cross the border to Mexico and have lunch and then come back for, to have an afternoon meeting. And similarly for alcohol use, it's also a really unique place because right around the border in Mexico, legal drinking age is 18. So for college students who are under the age of 21 can cross the border and engage in legal drinking. And alcohol also costs usually a lot less in Mexico compared to the US. So these kind of unique social conditions also makes studying acculturation process at the border particularly interesting to us. And what is also unique about US-Mexico border is that people actually have a lot of disadvantages. So it has particularly high poverty rates compared to other non-border regions in Texas. And also there are lower levels of educational attainment in this population as well. So people have described this as 2 countries, 1 culture, if you will. So to the extent that it's a unique environment where intermixing of cultures happen, and for college students, we know that socially motivated drinking is one of the common and important determinant of alcohol use. So what happens to these college students living at the US-Mexico border? If they are more US oriented and buy into the idea that alcohol use can be used as a social vehicle just to hang out with friends, and it's kind of a rite of passage among college students, then maybe they're more likely to kind of engage in higher rates of drinking and perhaps also engage in, have more negative consequences associated with drinking. So that led us to kind of conduct a study with Hispanics at the US-Mexico border, looking at not only the whether social motives predict alcohol use outcomes with Hispanics, like it would in other populations already conducted, as well as the interaction between social motives and acculturation or enculturation. So the study included about 200 participants, and we measured their acculturation orientation, both in terms of US orientation as well as heritage orientation. And we used a drinking motives questionnaire, the DMQ, to measure not only social drinking motives, but also coping, enhancement, and conformity motives. And we used the daily drinking questionnaire and the Rutgers Alcohol Problems Index to assess their alcohol consumption levels, as well as severity of negative drinking related consequences. So looking at alcohol consumption, accounting for covariates such as sex and age, we saw that while actually social motives was not a robust predictor in this sample, rather, we see that enhancement motive was kind of a marginally significant moderator, a direct predictor of alcohol consumption. And the reason that I say that this finding, even though it's statistically significant, is maybe not quite reliable because the confidence interval actually is right at 0. So more work needs to be sort of conducted with larger sample sizes to replicate this finding. Even accounting for these social motives, acculturation does in fact predict alcohol consumption over and above these other factors. But we didn't see an interaction between social motives and acculturation or enculturation with these other covariates in the model. Looking at negative drinking related consequences, we saw that motives did predict negative drinking related consequences much more robustly than acculturation related factors. But this case, we're seeing the effects of coping and conformity motives, kind of consistent with prior literature that for people who experience drinking problems, it really has more to do with drinking for reasons to cope with negative affect, or they just want to fit in, rather than for reasons related to just feeling high or socializing with folks. So for the most part, we see that the potential impact of drinking motives on alcohol use is replicated in Hispanic US border town individuals compared to what has been known in the mainstream literature. And what is interesting is, compared to other studies that's been conducted on acculturation and alcohol use with Hispanics, acculturation seems to function differently for people living at the border. So rather than being a potential risk factor, acculturation to the US mainstream seems to indicate a lower level of consumption. So if we're thinking about people living at the border, as I mentioned, it's very Mexican oriented. People really have no problem, getting by not speaking a word of English, and a lot of people that they hang out with are more likely to be same ethnic peers. Then perhaps the mainstream US, drinking cultural influence is less salient in this kind of environmental context. If anybody have talked to people who have lived in both Mexico, US border town, and kind of non-border town areas, they would say, if I were to move from Mexico to a US border town, it's like, it's not like I missed much. It's not like I have to function very much differently. Whereas the cultural transition experience from a US border town to a non-border town, even if it's just in Texas, in the same state, they would say that acculturation process is actually much more salient. They feel like they have to do more adaptation. They have to sort of relive their life, sort of reorient their life much more drastically. So that suggests, maybe at the US border town, the meaning of acculturation and sort of what they are acculturating to is quite saliently different. So that's something that we need to, I think, look into further through in what context might acculturation mean something entirely different. And the fact that we see enhancement and coping motives as robust predictors of negative drinking-related consequences suggests that we need to really look at these vulnerable and understudied population much more closely, particularly thinking about some of these economic or social disadvantages that happen at the border town. So before this seminar started, we were just talking how people at the border town are actually much more affected by COVID. Compared to even in the same states, non-border towns. So some of these stressors might prompt maladaptive drinking outcomes in these populations as well. So from the study, it really drives home to me, at least, the idea that acculturation is not just some simple kind of process. It's quite dynamic. But what about acculturation? So far, we have really research tended to measure people's cultural orientations, either in the US direction or kind of their immersion in their heritage or heritage culture. But what is going on with that process, with that lived experience of going through or navigating different sets of cultural expectations? Is it that, perhaps, is it a proxy for some kind of stressors associated with immigrants or associated with ethnic minorities experiences? Or is it the fact that acculturation taps into kind of broader drinking cultures in the US versus in their heritage environment? So if we're thinking about the drinking culture in the US, especially among college students, it's quite liberal. That drinking can be seen as a social lubricant, it's a rite of passage, that's what you do, and it's really important, kind of an experience as a college student especially. And it's also commonly considered as a stress remedy. It's okay to use alcohol if you had a hard day at work, go to happy hour and let loose, or maybe have a drink, just to drown in sorrows, if you will. So these cultural differences in drinking behaviors oftentimes influence when, why, where, how people consume alcohol, as well as how much they drink and how they think about the role of alcohol and drinking, as well as the different types of behaviors, either positive or protective or negative behaviors that they engage in before, during, and after a drinking episode. So then that kind of got me thinking about what happens even within group differences. So if you remember earlier at the top of my talk, I was talking about how we are consistently observing within group differences across nativity statuses, and that people who are born in the US are more likely to consume alcohol more frequently, drink at greater volume, as well as more likely to meet diagnostic criteria for an alcohol use disorder compared to their immigrant counterparts. What is particularly interesting for me is I love paradoxes. I love puzzles. I like things that don't fit, because that's, intrinsically just, I just want to, resolve that issue. Is if we're thinking about the cultural transition, remember that image that I showed earlier? People have to, pack their bags, leave their family, what they've known their whole life behind, come to a foreign country, a brand new environment that they have to, reorient themselves. That process, it has a lot of uncertainties, a lot of unknowns, and can be quite stressful. So you would imagine these immigrants actually experience more negative health outcomes compared to people who are born in the US, who are settled, who potentially have more resources. Actually, we see quite the opposite. Across many health outcomes, immigrants actually fare better compared to their native-born counterparts. So this is also shown with alcohol use. And a lot of the research, epidemiological research, has invoked the acculturation process to understand these ethnic these within ethnic differences. Particularly, there are two sets of theories. One has to do with the healthy immigrant hypothesis, suggesting that maybe it's the people who are healthier, who don't have the vulnerabilities to engage in these addictive behaviors, are more likely to be able to come to the US from their heritage culture and stay behind. And for the people who are maybe sick or poor, have a hard time, settling in well, and then they might have to return to their home country. So this is kind of the salmon bias that people have talked about. And the second theory that people have talked about has to do with this erosion theory. So the idea that there's something unique to these immigrants, and over generation, they have these protective maybe assets or cultural values that really discourage them from engaging in addictive behaviors. But over time, the longer they spend in the US, the more they're withdrawn from their heritage culture, these protection actually erodes. These, these protective factors actually dissipate. So not many research have directly tested these theories, and it's almost impossible to be able to do so. Rather, what we found is, well, why don't we just ask the people who have these lived experiences? Ask them, what about your cultural environments that might have to do with your drinking behaviors? What have you noticed in your community? So we conduct a qualitative study to hopefully shed some light on these dynamic and complex process, sort of looking at what might explain these nativity differences. And particularly, we're interested in finding out what are potentially some of these active ingredients that might explain the conceptual understanding of nativity differences. So we went into the community and conducted a series of focus group interviews with Mexican Americans. Now, for the study, they didn't have to be drinkers, but it just so happens that people who came into the study and completed our interviews all indicated that they have been drinking at some point in their life. And we conducted the focus group interviews and then transcribed their responses and did kind of grounded theory in encoding their responses, and we identified three main themes from their interviews. The first one, participants are telling us the reasons that we might see the patterns associated with immigrant paradox might be because there is greater risk to drinking-related problems in the US compared to their home country in Mexico. So on the one hand, there are these social contexts that really promote frequent higher volume drinking, such as at bars, college parties, and these other alcohol-driven celebrations. So participants said, as a quote, "I think American culture, alcohol is more like something you use, a tool that you use to party, while in Mexico, it might not be that way." People have said, a bar in Mexico is only for drunks to hang out. A bar in the US is a place to socialize, to gather. They don't frown upon it. You don't see it as a bad place. So, so these kind of suggest that these social contexts mean something different in the US, which normalizes drinking behaviors compared to in Mexico. And the media certainly have a lot more ads and make alcohol use something that's desirable, something that's fun, and could further perpetuate the nativity differences that we see as well. What was interesting was within the idea, the theme of exposure to risks in the US, people have noticed some gender differences too. What they're saying is here in the US, if a woman drinks, she's liberal. Whereas in Mexico, women aren't supposed to get drunk. And it's also more acceptable for a man to get drunk in Mexican culture. And people would say, oh, it's just because he works so much or he had a rough day. So the gender difference in terms of alcohol use is much greater in Mexico compared to in the US. And actually that is quite consistent with what we saw in the meta-analysis, and that the association between acculturation, kind of that cultural transition process, and alcohol use is much more robust for women compared to men. And finally, participants said, yeah, when people are living in the US for longer, they're probably more exposed to increased levels of stress because, one, in the US, life is faster, it has more demands, so it's more stressful. And if we're thinking about alcohol use as a coping mechanism, well, it makes sense. People also talked about, for Mexican Americans, the process, the experience of not fitting in, either in the mainstream and they kind of in between. They're neither quite Mexican, they're not considered as quite American as well. So that kind of bicultural stress also have to do with drinking to cope. So that is one main theme that we have identified that might explain nativity differences in Mexican American drinking. And then the other theme that participants are telling us has to do with sort of consistent with this erosion theory, that there are Mexican values and behavioral repertoires that actually declines over time. And one is participants repeatedly told us, well, in my culture, in Mexican culture, we are socialized from very early on how to drink safely. Whereas in the US, it's assumed that when you hit 21, you can go drink, and your parents don't really teach you how to drink responsibly and how to know your limits. So a participant said, it's just the holding your liquor part, really learning how to drink. My family members don't want you to get sloppy drunk. They want you to learn how to drink. So whenever you are put into that situation, usually a high risk situation, you know your limits and know when to say no and drink as much your limit lets you. So that kind of speaks to perhaps kind of how people in their families and their cultures kind of approach drinking and alcohol use is quite different in the Mexican culture and the US culture. So as time goes on, as if their parents are already native born, second generation Mexican Americans, the third generation individuals are not really getting the cultural socialization around safe drinking practices. So consistent with kind of the stress processes, participants also said, well, my family and community support actually is really important to me if I'm an immigrant. But if we're becoming more Americanized, more individualistic, we're really not relying on our family as much. Sort of that bond is weakened over time. So if you don't have anything or anybody and stress comes up, then you're more likely maybe to turn to these maladaptive behaviors such as alcohol use to cope. And finally, because the collectivistic cultural orientation and the importance of Catholicism, the religious and cultural sanctions are one of those things that participants talked about as well. Is it really governs how they don't engage in these quote unquote antisocial or deviant behaviors such as hazardous drinking or other drug use. What is actually not expected by us going into this study was participants talked about these immigrant-specific deterrents. So things like they are worried about getting into legal problems if they engage in hazardous drinking and then get pulled over by police for drinking under the influence. Because for immigrants, you have something to lose. Whereas for a native born individual, you're a citizen, you don't have to worry about, they won't deport you or separate you from the family. So kind of the worry about potential legal consequences really is a protective factor for immigrants. As well as immigrants are more likely to come to the US for some specific reasons, usually to better their own or their family's lives. So they don't want to jeopardize that by engaging in hazardous drinking. And participants said it's possible that immigrants also don't have a lot of disposable income if they're working 2, 3, multiple jobs to make a living. So they don't have the money to spend on alcohol. So from this kind of qualitative interview sort of approach, we didn't see strong evidence for healthy immigrant hypothesis, but we did find support for kind of the acculturation process as well as the erosion theory. But at least now we know what might be some of the explanatory reasons, some potential factors, these active ingredients that underlie the associations that we might have seen in past generations of research. So participants really kind of drive home the idea that culture can indirectly or maybe even directly influence individuals' drinking practices, how they think about alcohol, so the motivations to drink, and then how they go about protecting themselves if they're in high-risk drinking situations. And kind of the collective values or the social norms might govern how, when, and how they approach drinking. So this got me really interested and excited about potential protection that we can help reduce health disparities affecting ethnic minority, including Hispanic populations. So it's also one of those malleable things that we can actually do in treatment. So if we can up these maybe collectivistic values or reinforce these social norms that protect people or prevent them from engaging in alcohol misuse in the first place, we can actually, be really helpful in the future. So this is one paper that we're currently working on. It's a rather simple study. We wanted to see the ethnic differences that we see between Hispanics and Euro-Americans. Does that have anything to do with the way that people refuse to drink in high-risk situations as one of the protective behaviors? So research has shown that for people who are able, who feel like they have the ability to refuse to drink, they're obviously more likely to drink less and drink less frequently. What is really exciting to me is a study by Katie Wikowitz had shown that we can actually train drinking refusal self-efficacy. We kind of sort of assertiveness training, if you will. And the effect actually was shown both in African American as well as Euro American participants. But the effect actually was much stronger for African Americans even compared to Euro Americans. So meaning if we can train people to refuse to drink in high risk situation, it might serve as more important protective factor for African Americans or for ethnic minorities compared to whites. So well, perhaps this can be similar for Hispanics as well. Now, we don't see any research on drinking refusal self-efficacy, a lot of work on protective behavioral strategies in ethnic minority populations. So here's kind of the first step that we're taking. So we're looking at the differences between Hispanics and Euro Americans in terms of not only their drinking outcomes, but also their drinking refusal self-efficacy. And on a mean level wise, we see that Euro Americans actually drink more frequently and reported more negative drinking related consequences than Hispanics, but they also report higher levels of drinking refusal self-efficacy. We did see a correlation, a moderate correlation between drinking refusal self-efficacy and negative drinking related problems for Euro Americans, but not for Hispanics. So if we include both of these predictors in a model predicting drinking-related problems, what we're seeing is accounting for covariates. When we include drinking refusal self-efficacy in the negative binomial regression model, the association between ethnicity and drinking-related problems kind of dropped off, suggesting that the reason that we see these ethnic differences in drinking outcomes might be in part because of drinking refusal self-efficacy. So this could be a way to actually, leverage in treatment or prevention for Hispanics down the road. So that's kind of where I'm very excited in kind of continue this line of work, looking at ethnic differences in motives as well as protective behavioral strategies, both at an individual level as well as at a community level. And particularly, I think we really need to tease out further if acculturation is sort of an important cultural contextual factor for influencing alcohol use. What about, kind of what's going on? Under what conditions might these be related to maybe people's own beliefs, their own personality characteristics, the way that they approach drinking activities? Those are things that are, needed to be teased out. And certainly, when we think about intercultural contact for ethnic minorities, I think we are aware that racism occurs and discrimination can be really stressful. So my other lines of research is kind of continuously using different methods to tease out how might these ethnic specific stressors, such as racism, discrimination, be linked to these individual difference factors over and above the prediction, such as neuroticism, general stress, general motives for drinking, but also where some of the underlying causal mechanisms might occur. So we're analyzing some longitudinal studies and also designing in-lab experiments to tease out the process to see, are people experiencing racial discrimination related stressors, maybe more in real time measure their craving for drinking and, their preference for different, adaptive or maladaptive behaviors. So to tease out some of these, processes. So obviously I can't do this work by myself. So I thank my RAs in my research lab. But I'm really curious to see what questions that folks might have or maybe comments, kind of where this line of research could go in the future.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lui. I'm very excited to hear this. I think this gives us a new perspective on the topic of alcohol misuse that we haven't heard this year. So I'm really excited to hear your presentation. I'm going to start with a quick question, and then we have one from Dr. Lees and one from Dr. Yee. So I'll start with, I'm just curious about, you mentioned kind of the fear of legal consequences and potentially impacting immigration status and other things, given that substance use and alcohol use is so criminalized in our country. But you have a unique situation, especially for emerging adults, where they're coming from a country where it was legal to drink at age 18, 19, 20. Now they're in the United States where it is illegal. So do you think that there's some interesting things that might be happening in that kind of age range?
Yeah, so if I'm understanding your question correctly, so for that study, we didn't, they're not just college students. These are community adults of all ages and average around like 30-ish. So what was interesting was we have to kind of contextualize when we collected the data. So when we collected the data, I think for some interview groups, literally the weekend before, there are some ICE, operations happened in Dallas. So I think sort of the threat of legal consequences and then the separation of family, especially, at the border and so forth, it's fresh on the minds of a lot of people. And we did ask people, it's like, well, but what about for immigrants who are now immigrants, maybe like they're permanent residents or citizens, where deportation is not really a concern? But they're saying like it doesn't matter because people don't look at you, differently. So that just the worry is still there. I don't think any of our participants specifically said it's about the legal drinking age, so to speak. It's more just kind of the broader societal environment, how they're received as Mexican Americans in general. But yeah, like I certainly think that's interesting, especially that's why the U.S.-Mexico border is so interesting, right? Because you can engage in underage drinking and legal drinking just minutes away.
Yeah,
So,
it's interesting. It's interesting.
yeah.
Okay, Bruce.
Thank you.
Okay.
I want to thank you for an extraordinarily informative and well-organized presentation containing a lot of really valuable information in a very short time. So thank you for that. And I hope you can hear me because I'm actually very near the Mexican-American border right now in a truck. So hopefully you can hear me. Yeah. So we have developed several programs for treating addictions, and we find it difficult, as I'm sure you would have predicted, to recruit or provide services to underserved groups, particularly from various minorities. And I was wondering what you have found regarding perceptions of what did you find about people's perceptions about what qualifies them as having an alcohol problem, and what does it take to recruit people or provide services to people? I'm sure it's different from culture to culture, as we have found.
Yeah, great question. So I think the first part has to do with, let me speak to the kind of the service or reaching people in the first place part. So what we have found is we really need to use kind of a community organized kind of approach to reach these underserved and understudied populations. So especially for the qualitative study, we had a team of undergraduate students and other individuals who are Mexican American backgrounds themselves. So they have the connection, they know what churches to go to post flyers, and to talk to folks in grocery stores. And our advertising materials are in English and Spanish. Granted that we didn't conduct the interviews in Spanish for just more standardized purposes, but that helped a lot in a lot of ways. One is sort of the face validity, is people trust, has a more intrinsic trust in, I think, the scientist. It's not something like, oh, you're an ivory tower, why am I talking to you? And I think that also is helpful for engaging people in treatment as well. So some of the things that I found, at least clinically, is for these underserved communities, it doesn't necessarily matter, who they are, is oftentimes integration is really important. I think a lot of folks know for folks coming from underrepresented minority groups, they don't think of the first go-to is, I'm going to go see a psychologist because I have behavioral problems or because I have an addiction. Usually they go see maybe their physician, see maybe in a community clinic, or maybe their church, authority members, and they get to talking. And people are like, you know what, you might want to see somebody. And let me go down the hall because I have a colleague who's a behavioralist, you can, talk to them rather than saying, well, go schedule an appointment in this other clinic because they're not going to follow up. So sort of that integration, and that's the process makes it a little more streamlined, I think is really helpful. And certainly other things such as reducing stigma and the barriers that people have, could go a long way. So I think the first question that you asked, what was it? Perception of addiction. That is a huge point, because especially in Hispanics, people don't think of alcohol misuse as a problem. They might say, oh, my dad always just, growing up, I see my dad drinking just, a 6-pack, just, sitting in front of TV after dinner, and then he would just doze off, and, but my mom wouldn't say a thing because that's just what he does. And it's like, oh no, actually that is, hazardous drinking. That is actually at-risk behavior. So I do think the how we define, drinking problems or alcohol use disorder, is something there's a discrepancy in what we know, how we define as academics, as researchers, and in some of these communities as well. So I think just even basic level psychoeducation can be really helpful.
That's great. I think that's lots of practical advice. I was thinking similarly, a lot of the measures that we use, like the Rutgers inventory and these others, are, may not directly apply to certain cultures. We have time for one more quick question from Rich, and then we'll wrap up for today.
Hi, Priscilla. Thank you for a really nice presentation. I'm kind of curious about the effects of acculturation kind of generally versus acculturation specifically to the United States. And you kind of mentioned that. I'm wondering if you're aware of any literature looking at acculturation to, for example, other countries that perhaps have different social norms around drinking than the United States.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to think. I want to say most studies that we included in our systematic reviews, or even in our other literature searches, generally specific to alcohol use, to addiction, has to do with in the US mainstream. I think if we're thinking about other health outcomes like obesity or diet and depression, for example, there's more with other in other societies as well. So, but usually what happens is people in kind of the intercultural contact or transition, going from their own heritage culture to usually a kind of a Western society. Like even if the receiving culture, if it's not in the US, it's going to be Canada, it's going to be European countries. So where they tend to have maybe more individualistic kind of approach to life compared to where people are immigrating to. And I certainly think it would be really interesting to see maybe in Spain or maybe like France, where if someone is immigrating from Mexico to those countries, what that will look like. Because in the US, we have a kind of a culture where alcohol use is used a lot, but then it's more likely to be these high risk kind of enhancement related behaviors, whereas in European country, it's a wet drinking culture, but it's normalized, right? So I do think we need to, that's kind of one of the things that I'm trying to do, is unpack acculturation, not just use these broad measures of what language do you speak and what foods do you prefer, but really getting into what about the process is linked to, say, alcohol use behavior, or maybe other kinds of health risk outcomes.
Great. I think we will wrap up there. I want to thank Dr. Lui on behalf of the CLC leadership team and the rest of our members of our center for a great seminar talk today. I also want to thank all of our attendees for taking time on your Friday morning to join us for today. This is the final talk of the seminar series for this semester, but please check our website and Twitter for information on our brown bag and seminar talks for the spring semester, which will resume, I believe they're set to resume in February of 2021. So I hope everyone has a safe week next week, and we will see you again for our next seminar in the new year. Thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you. Great seminar.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Wonderful job, Priscilla. I
Thanks.
learned so much from this talk. I really did.
Well, you're so kind.
I was thinking about it as you were presenting, and you know use the Rutgers, and I made a note. It's like, are motives and problems generalizable across cultures? And I think that's a really interesting, because these are normed in major ivory tower universities at heavily white college towns on university students, and it's like, can you directly just take that measure and put it into El Paso or some other border town?
Well, I think, well, the good thing is